Picture the cowboy. The white hat, the squared jaw, the face that has stared out from 1,000 movie posters. Now hold that picture. Because here is the number the picture never shows you. By the best estimates historians can build, close to 1 in 3 of the men who drove the great cattle herds north were black or Mexican. Hollywood spent the better part of a century quietly painting over them. The most American figure we have, the Lone Rider, the symbol of the frontier itself, turns out to be not American at all. Hit subscribe and like before we go further, because what comes next was never in your textbook. Start with the thing nobody teaches you. The cowboy you think you know was built, tool by tool and word by word, by black and Mexican men America would later write out of the story. And it begins with a fact that sounds almost like a trick. The cowboy was never Anglo to begin with. He was Mexican. Listen to the language of the trade. Because the language gives the whole thing away, a buckaroo is just an English mouth trying to say vaquero. The lariat a cowboy throws comes from lariata, the rope, lasso, comes from lazo. The leather chaps that guard his legs from the brush are chaparreras, named for the chaparral they pushed through. Rodeo, bronco, ranch, corral, stampede. The Mustang he rides is a mesteño, a stray. Walk through a cowboy's whole working day, and almost every word in his mouth started in Spanish. It goes far past the words. The high western saddle, the one built to take the shock of a roped steer, is a vaquero saddle. The roping itself, the dally around the horn, the way a man reads cattle and turns a herd, the hot iron and the registered brand. All of it was worked out by the vaqueros of Spanish California and Spanish Texas more than 200 years before the first Anglo ever called himself a cowboy. The Spanish brought cattle and horses to the Americas back in the 1500s. By the time the United States pushed to the Rio Grande, there was already a complete cattle culture waiting there, with its own gear, its own skills, and its own men, the vaqueros, who had been doing this work for generations. You can stand in the proof of it. The Spanish missions and ranchos of California ran on cattle, and the men who handled those cattle, who branded them and broke the horses and drove them to market, were vaqueros working a system already old. When Americans poured west after the Civil War, they did not invent cattle work. They learned it, they hired the men who already knew it, and they copied the gear down to the stitching. Even the Texas Longhorn that built the great drives was a Spanish animal. Descended from cattle the Spanish had turned loose generations before. So here is the trouble. If the saddle is Mexican, and the rope is Mexican, and the words are Mexican, and the whole craft is Mexican, then the white cowboy of the movies is not the origin of anything. He is a paint job, which means somebody at some point picked up a brush. The question that runs under everything else tonight is simple. Who decided to make the cowboy white, and why? Start with that erased third, and start with the part that is hardest to pin down. The numbers. There was never a census of cowboys by race. What we have are payrolls, memoirs, photographs, and the estimates historians have built from them. And those estimates land in a wide band. A figure you will hear often is that roughly 1 in 4 trail hands was black. Add the Mexican vaqueros riding the same drives, and the share of non-white riders climbs toward a third, and in some outfits higher. Treat those as informed estimates, not hard counts. But even the cautious version tells you something the movies never did. On a typical drive up from Texas, you would have been riding alongside black and Mexican men as a matter of course, not as an exception. There is a reason so many of them were Texan. Before the war, Texas ranches ran on enslaved labor, and a great deal of that labor was cattle work. When emancipation came, thousands of black men walked off those ranches with one of the few skills the frontier actually paid for. They could rope, ride, brand, and red a herd. The cattle boom that followed the war needed exactly those hands, and it needed a lot of them. Put a face on it. Nat Love was born into slavery in Tennessee in 1854. After the war he went west as a teenager, hired on with a Texas outfit, and spent years on the trail. By his own account, on the 4th of July in 1876, in the rough mining town of Deadwood up in Dakota Territory, he won a roping and shooting contest so cleanly that the crowd pinned a nickname on him that stuck for the rest of his life. Deadwood Dick. Late in life he wrote it all down in a memoir. And that memoir is one of the very few first-person records we have of a black cowboy telling his own story. Historians read it with care because Love was plainly enjoying the legend he had become. And the tall tales run thick, but the spine of it is solid. A man born owned, who rode out of bondage and made his name on pure skill. Set beside him a quieter man. Bose Ikard was born enslaved in Mississippi around 1843 and raised in Texas. After the war he rode for Charles Goodnight. one of the most powerful cattlemen in the West, on the brutal Goodnight-loving trail that pushed cattle up through New Mexico and Colorado. Goodnight trusted Ikard with things he trusted almost no one else with. Ikard carried the outfit's money on the trail, partly because thieves were less likely to guess that the Black Hand was the one holding the cash. He stood with Goodnight through stampedes and through fights. And when Ikard died in 1929, Goodnight paid for a granite marker over his grave and wrote the words on it himself. He praised the man's loyalty and his courage, and said plainly that Ikard never shirked a duty. A white cattle baron, carving a freedman's worth into stone. That is closer to the real West than anything John Wayne ever filmed. And yet notice the word itself. On a lot of outfits, the black hands were the ones called cowboys, while the white men preferred cowhand, drover, cattleman, anything but boy. In that era, calling a grown black man boy was not casual. It was a deliberate way of cutting a man down, of keeping a line drawn even where the work was shared. Historians still argue over how widely that held. And the word cowboy has older and tangled roots that reach back before the cattle drives, but the pattern turns up too often in the record to wave away. Even out here, on the open trail, far from the courthouse and the church and the segregated town, there was a line. And the line is exactly where we look next. The pay was thin for everyone. A trail hand made somewhere between $25 and $40 a month, plus his food and the use of horses from the outfit's string. Call it about $1 a day for work that could kill you. You were in the saddle before dawn and you stayed there. You slept on the ground in whatever the weather gave you. You ate dust for months. The day itself was a system, not an adventure. The herd moved in a fixed shape. 2 riders up front at the point set the direction. Riders along the swing and the flank kept the sides from spreading, and the drag riders pushed the stragglers from behind. Where a man rode in that shape was a ranking, and everyone on the outfit understood it without a word being said. So here is where the line drawn back in town quietly followed the men out onto the trail. Someone had to ride drag, where 2,000 animals kick up a wall of grit that you breathe for 10 or 12 hours until your spit runs black. On a lot of outfits, that job drifted toward the black and Mexican hands, while the prized spots up at the point went to the white riders. And someone had to take the river crossings. Picture a swollen river after rain, the far bank 100 yards off, the herd bunched and bawling at the edge. A horse goes in swimming with a man on its back, trying to keep 2,000 frightened animals pointed at the other side. If the herd turns and starts to mill in the current, it becomes a churning circle that pulls everything down into the middle. Men drowned doing this. Horses rolled. And when the most dangerous crossing of the day had to be led, that risk did not always fall evenly. The Mexican vaqueros carried more than their share of it too, and many of them were the most skilled riders on the whole drive. Men whose families had worked cattle for 100 years. The Anglo bosses knew it and hired them for exactly that. But skill did not buy a vaquero a seat at the top. He was paid, and he was placed, by a hierarchy that had nothing to do with how well he rode. The work was shared, the worst of it was not, but the trail was also a strange place, and honesty means saying so. Out there, a man's life could hang on the rider next to him, and a stampede did not care what color the hands were that turned it. Skill was real currency. A black cowboy who could rope and ride and hold his nerve in a run earned a kind of respect on the trail that the segregated East would never have handed him. Men ate from the same pot and slept around the same fire. It was not equality. Do not let anyone sell you that it was. The same man who was trusted with the herd could be turned away from a saloon or a hotel the moment the cattle were sold and the town closed around him. The trail loosened the line. It never erased it. These were the men who built the thing. The skills, the gear, the whole working shape of a job that the movies would later turn into a white legend. They built the icon, and then they watched it get taken from them. So how does a craft invented by Mexicans and carried north by black freedmen end up in the popular mind as the whitest figure in American life? It did not happen by accident. It was sold. It started with the dime novels. From the 1860s on, cheap paperbacks poured out of Eastern printing houses by the hundreds of thousands, and the publishers discovered that the West sold. The cowboy of those pages was almost always a white hero, clean and brave and deadly, riding through a country scrubbed of the men who actually filled it. The dime novel did not report the frontier. It manufactured one, the frontier that readers in New York and Boston wanted to buy. Then the West learned to perform itself. In 1883, William Cody, the man the country knew as Buffalo Bill, took his Wild West show on the road, and it grew into one of the most popular spectacles on Earth. It put real riders and real stunts in front of millions across America and Europe, and it fixed an image in their heads. The hero of that arena was the White Scout and the White Cowboy. There were extraordinary Mexican performers in those very shows. A roper named Vicente Oropeza dazzled crowds with skill that helped invent trick roping as Americans came to know it. But Oropeza was billed as an exotic spectacle, not as the hero. The hero, the man the crowd was taught to be, looked like Buffalo Bill. Film took the baton and never gave it back. From the first Western reels at the turn of the century, through the silent stars, and on into the sound era, the cowboy on the screen was white. And the erasure of the Mexican was worse than erasure. He was not simply removed, he was recast. Over and over, early Hollywood turned the vaquero, the man who built the entire craft, into the bandit, the villain, the knife in the dark that the white hero had to gun down. The people who invented the cowboy got handed the role of his enemy. By the 1930s and 40s, directors like John Ford and an actor born Marion Morrison, who the world would know as John Wayne, had cast the whole figure in something close to bronze. The Wayne cowboy was tall, white, plain-spoken, and alone, and he became shorthand for America itself. Understand why it was worth doing. By the late 1800s, the open range was already dying. Fenced off by barbed wire and cut up by the railroads the cattle drives had served, the real cowboy was vanishing into history almost as fast as he had appeared, and that made him safe to mythologize. You can build a clean legend around a man who is no longer around to complicate it. And the legend was useful. A young, anxious country wanted a hero who stood for rugged independence and the rightful taming of a wild land. A white frontiersman fit that story. A Mexican vaquero whose people had been there first, or a black freedman a few years out of slavery, did not, so the marketplace and the national mood pulled in the very same direction, and the cowboy got whiter with every decade he sank into the past. A few real men still broke through the curtain. Bill Pickett was a black cowboy who invented the technique that became steer wrestling, and he thrilled enormous crowds in the early 1900s. But the promoters who put him in the arena sometimes billed him as something other than black just to get him through the gate. And the film business growing up beside the rodeo had almost no room for a black lead. The pattern was set. The real men got a few footnotes, the painted man got the century. But the paint was always only paint. Underneath it, the real men were still there. Put the pieces back together and the whole picture inverts. The gear was Mexican. The words were Mexican. The skills were worked out by vaqueros generations before the United States arrived to claim them. As much as a third of the men on the great drives were black or Mexican. The freedmen who rode out of Texas bondage carried the trade north on their own backs. Nat Love made his name on skill the country preferred to forget he had. Charles Goodnight cut Bose Ikard's worth into granite, while the rest of the nation cut him out of the story altogether. And then the dime novelists and the showmen and the studios spent 100 years with a brush, painting that crowded, mixed, sunburned reality a single shade of white. That answers the question we started with. Nobody ever signed an order to make the cowboy white. It was something quieter and far more durable than that. It was 1,000 small choices by people selling a product. A publisher who knew a white hero moved more copies. A showman who knew his crowd. A studio that knew its stars. Erasure does not always look like a crime. Sometimes it just looks like marketing, repeated so many times that the lie becomes the memory. The cowboy is the most American thing we have. We put him on our money, in our movies, at the center of how we picture ourselves. And he was built, from the saddle up, by the very people America worked hardest to erase. So, the next time that figure rides across the screen, the white hat, the white face, alone against the sky, remember what the image is hiding. That hat is sitting on the wrong head. The man who earned it was rarely the man who got to wear it.